Okay, ladies and gentlemen, this is Paul Sims once again from eyeforpharma speaking to you from London. Very pleased to be moderating today's session. This is a topic that I believe is absolutely crucial for our industry, and actually it's been very clear that you do too, as we have around 700 people signed up for today's session, almost all from the US, as we are talking today about the US environment specifically. So I guess I'm the odd one out today. But yes, real life data, why this is the key element in any value demonstration. I suppose the motivation for this topic was born from our general research, which we do a lot of here at eyeforpharma, where it was made very clear to us that improving value demonstration for payers and other stakeholders was an absolute priority for most executives. And indeed, within that, there was a desire to look at what we are today calling real-life data. That is data coming from relatively new sources, such as PROs, wearables, sensors, and we'll hear a lot more about that in just a moment. But the promise of technology is, of course, very exciting, but we all know it's about a lot more than just the technology itself, and we're going to expand on a lot of that over the next hour. The other reason why we're choosing this topic and running this session is because we found a very solid partner in Evidation Health, who've been helping us create today's webinar. This is very clearly an area that they're doing some pioneering work in, and they've been an excellent person to work with in the course of setting this up. And if you're not familiar with them, then you will be shortly, and I encourage you to explore further. So effectively today, we are really looking for a more effective digital evidence generation strategy, defining value up front, ensuring that we've got the right patient insights in place, and of course then being able to optimize a holistic proposition that we can present to those who are making decisions, payers, etc., and of course gain reimbursement for. But I'm not the expert in the room. I'd like to introduce very briefly the lovely smiling faces you'll see on your screen in front of you. So top left, we have Lisa. Now, many of you, of course, know Lisa already. She's had an illustrious career in pharma, including creating her own company at one point. She's at Sanofi, but she has worked at Pfizer, and as well as her current role, which some of you might say is not aligned completely with this topic, but Lisa does have a very successful track record of developing evidence to address both FDA and needs and support of product approval and market access. She's also participated as a senior leader on committees responsible for licensing and portfolio decisions, and she, of course, particularly recently has developed innovative patient-focused and multi-sector partnerships to promote healthcare access and quality. So more than qualified to be here with us today. Thank you, Lisa, for joining. Underneath her, you'll see a very interesting name, Everett Neville. Everett is joining us from Express Scripts, and Everett's worked 25 years in healthcare, of which 20 have been at Express Scripts, and in his current role as SVP of supply chain, he has responsibility for a very broad range of pharma products, relationships, and contracts. And he manages to combine this with an SVP role at Acredo specialty as well. Now, we're obviously incredibly grateful that Everett is joining us. And in talking to him earlier today, it was clear that he believes that despite what the media and even what our own industry association has been saying in its recent narrative, that his company is on the same side as pharma in trying to bring innovative medicines to patients in a sustainable way. But his insights, of course, will be very valuable as we go forward. Next is Christine. Christine is currently working as an advisor to Evidation Health, but has been with Humana since 2005, and in her most recent role was Vice President of Wellness Strategies and Solutions, where she described her role as enabling over 25 million consumers to live happier, healthier lives through personalized and simple solutions that inspire and motivate them to achieve their best health. So Christine, of course, now working as an advisor to Evidation, very pertinent to today's discussion, and we're very grateful that you could be here, Christine. Thank you. And last but certainly not least is Andy. Andy actually has grown up in the regulatory and quality arena within our industry, and hence provides a very interesting perspective in his time that he's spent with both small and large companies, not just pharma, but also vaccines and devices. In fact, he's developed, filed, and launched more than 11 new products with various companies, and he's been a participant in over 50 US and foreign regulatory inspections, and in fact even was an FDA investigator for a short period of time. So I think we've got a pretty solid lineup. I hope you agree with me. But that's enough talking from me, because that's not the reason why you came today. I'm going to hand over to Christine at this point, who's just going to introduce a few short slides setting the scene for the upcoming discussion. So Christine, over to you.
Great, thanks, Paul. You know, health is complex because it's underpinned by an important human element, the patient. You know, patients' lives are complex, and the episodic view we have of them today from doctors' visits and clinical trials does not give us the full picture, as illustrated on this next slide. So as you think about this next slide and sort of what we traditionally have is we have this visual data, and this is the stuff that happens in terms of what comes through the claim system, you know, what comes through the EMR, et cetera, and that yet there's a whole bunch of additional data that happens in real time, that happens between those office visits, that happens, you know, outside of a picture view that we have. On the next slide, you know, it's important for us to kind of understand that as we think about value creation, as we think about really understanding kind of the patient differently, you know, we recognize that you have to unlock some secrets. It's hard to take on this risk and evaluate interventions or segment and personalize treatments for patients when you don't know what's impacting their outcomes in the real world. That's a lot at stake, and we recognize that, and companies, you know, really need to look at the data that they have available to them to really sort of unlock these novel secrets to get an edge over the competition. And finally, for sake of conversation, what we wanted to do is ground everybody in understanding when we talk about real-life data, what does it mean, as illustrated on this next slide? It's things like wearable sensors and apps that help us surface novel real-time data with which we can deeply understand consumers' health context and longitudinal patterns. There's an overwhelming amount of new data generating from people today that can allow us to deeply understand the consumer's health context. We have always known that the patient's behavior directly influences symptomology and disease progression or regression in many therapeutic areas, but quantifying these impacts has traditionally been an elusive goal, and this has changed. So as we think about what is real-life data, it's things like the behavioral data, the things that come from activity trackers, your sleep, your diet, things off of social media, people's social cognition, et cetera. Then it's about the patient-reported stuff, the things that don't hit it into the EMR or the claims data, things like, you know, your symptomology, things like, you know, social determinants of care, et cetera. And then it's the contextual data. It's things like weather, where people are located, census data, et cetera. So as we think about combining that traditional sense of information that comes, you know, from the real practice data, things like clinical trial data, the pharmacy, medical claims, things that come out of the EHR, and coupling it with these advanced sort of real-life data, the things that happen in between those patient visits, we start to mash together both the visible data that we know and understand and appreciate today with the invisible data to really get a full picture of the consumer holistically. And with that, Paul, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Thank you so much. Well, that was a very strong introduction. I hope we all understand what we mean by real life, and I think this is a very pertinent discussion. Now, when I use the word discussion, I don't take that word lightly, because I'm hoping that, as well as the faces you see in front of you now, that this is going to be a conversation that we can all have between us. So I'm expecting a question, at least one question from each of you over the course of the next few minutes. But first, before you even do that, what I'm going to do is present a multiple choice question in front of you. So if you look at your screen now, you should see something pop up in front of you. So just launch that. There we go. What proportion of your current or near future drug launches will involve some type of real world data submission during the launch process? So we're not just talking about real life here, we're talking about everything that you might describe as real world. And this is just a kind of scene setter. I want to know where we are. As I said to you earlier, we've got a decent sized audience on the line, so this actually could be quite statistically significant. So I'll leave you another 5 seconds to answer that. I can see that about a third of you have voted so far, so get your votes in. 100% or close to it, or more than 50%, a minority less than 50%, or none or very little. Obviously, if you're speaking from a vendor or supplier or consultant position, then please do try and think about the clients, the average of what you've seen amongst your clients when you answer this question. I'll hold that open for 3 more seconds. 3, 2, 1. Thank you very much. Okay, we got most of you there. Let's have a look at the results. Okay, so we can see that this is a bit of a normal distribution, a slight skew towards the positive 100% end. So just under a fifth of you at 100%, nearly half of you at a majority area. Perhaps that's what you would have expected. A minority, about a quarter of you, and actually a not insignificant 8% on the none or very little area. So it's happening, but it's happening slowly is how I might describe it. And of course, I, as you can tell from my accent, hail from a non-US background, so it's very interesting to sort of take this into context with the rest of the world. So thank you so much for doing those. Now I realize that that's hopefully an interesting snapshot, but I'm going to go straight on to asking another poll question because I'm just greedy in that way. And I want you to, this one I think will provide a bit more of a talking point. So this one's a bit different in that you can answer more than one option, so take note, but I only want you to answer areas where you actually have experience and believe them to be effective. So what I'm asking you here is, what types of RWE are you finding most effective in demonstrating value during payer negotiations? One of the options is, of course, what Christina's just talked about, the real life data at the top. Electronic medical records, obviously a very core area, as is claims database data. PROs, so that's distinguished from the first one in being self-penned, as it were, by the patient, or other sources. Maybe there are other things on this list that we've missed out and that you feel. Now, technically, you could tick every single one of these boxes, but I very much hope that you don't, because, as I say, I want you to only choose the areas that you have actually done, have actually used, and believe to have been effective. So I'll hold that open. I've got about nearly 40% of you voted so far. Let's hold that open for another few seconds. Get your votes in. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Thank you very much, everybody. Okay. So let's have a look at this, and I think this will provide a good springboard for our discussion today. Only a third of people, Christine, have either used and found effective real-life data. So that perhaps isn't a surprise, but it's in my opinion, it's a strong start. Unsurprisingly, EMRs and claims database data performing the majority there. PROs, a healthy third again, and then some other sources. If you put in other, would you be so kind as to use your Q&A box and just quickly jot in what other sources of real-world evidence you found to be helpful, so that I can take a look at what you consider to be vital, as I may have missed off my list. I unfortunately only had 5 options max that I could put in. Okay, let's begin the discussion. I'm going to start, just because her name was top left on the previous slide, with Lisa, if that's all right. Lisa, I'm interested to hear your reaction, firstly, to what you have seen here, but also any examples and any recommendations that you have in selecting the types of real-world evidence and the criteria that you might use to actually determine those.
Well, first I'll make a comment. I would agree that this is consistent with the experience that I've seen and participated in, that in general payers tend to respond particularly to claims-based data and also EMRs, and that they in general have responded more to those in terms of value demonstrations than classically PROs. I think that the real-life data percentage may be because our access to those types of data sources is relatively recent. I would also suggest that this probably does and should vary by the types of diseases that we're talking about, which patient populations we're talking about, where real-life data might be more or less important. I'd venture to gain that certain types of areas, potentially like asthma or rheumatoid arthritis, or very symptomatic, and variable areas may be more amenable, and that may be why people are using that more or earlier. And so those would be some of my thoughts. In terms of making it most effective, I mean, I think it's pretty clear that most of us in the industry try to discuss with the relevant payers and other key stakeholders, including providers and patients, what types of data they think are going to be most useful in demonstrating what's happening to them as we try to improve their health. So I think understanding who our stakeholders are, what types of data are going to be most convincing to them is probably the most important question to start with before we start gathering data.
This is Andy. I'd like to chime in and suggest that these poll results don't surprise me in any way. However, I can suggest that based on some discussions over the last year with some key opinion leaders, that the suggestion has been put forth that particularly when you're having payer negotiations, that in these payer negotiations, the payers typically are relying more on claims database data than, say, real life or EMR data. And as a result, when you're having the negotiations, are less reluctant to make decisions based on other forms of data other than the claims database data. Now, to that extent, I would love to hear Everett's position on, say, claims database data versus PROs or EMR data.
Hi, Andy. This is Everett, and I'd echo actually what you said, and that from a payer perspective, we largely aren't using any of the what we're calling here real-world data for negotiations, decisions on formulary positioning, and edits, and for a number of reasons. Largely, most of the data we see it's interesting, but it's not distinguishing or differentiating or very usable. So we do give a little more credence to the claims database information that we get, but only so far as it supports what we see in the clinical studies. It's certainly not going to overturn our, if your clinical studies don't show it, we're not going to believe the real world data. If your real world data suggests you don't actually get those results, that may be a factor, but most companies don't actually show us that. The other, whether it's electronic medical records or the patient wearable, again, that falls into the very interesting category. Yeah. But it's not comparable. And the same reason that it's not a study, it's not the same, it's not the same patient populations, there's a lot of bias. To make a decision off of that would be very, very fraught with mistakes. And so still it comes down to the published studies, the package inserts with some support from the claims data and very little credence given to anything else.
Any response to that from our pharma colleagues, or Christine, would you like to have a say?
Yeah, so this is Christine. I would say a couple things. Just like the pharmaceutical industry is sort of nascent in looking at the real life data, I'm not surprised with some of these statistics. I would say that the payer community is also very nascent. Historically, the industry has relied on much of the claims information for a large part. They really haven't even had access to the information contained in the EMR, and that's a direction that's kind of shifting and moving. But there's also sort of these outside factors that the industry is sort of listening to and understanding the implications. And so just like every industry, resources are constrained. And so there has been this influx and consideration for things like remote patient monitoring, particularly for patients with congestive heart failure, COPD, those sorts of things. With a CHF patient, I think there's many health plans as well as even many providers that are leveraging scales because it's an earlier predictor. If the weight is going up by 2 pounds, that's a trigger and a triage to intervene with that patient more rapidly. And so, when you're looking at the data, I think there's a movement towards sort of this remote patient monitoring, but it is very nascent for the industry, and so I'm not surprised that it hasn't yet factored in to payer negotiations. But I do think that with a little bit more time and a little bit more runway, there is evidence, particularly, given my past experience, as well as what my colleagues in other companies, they are actually ingesting this information, they're using it, they're looking at things like loneliness, the impact of loneliness and not having sort of a social network. It's actually causing patients with diabetes, for example, to have $144 more per member per month of spend than individuals without who have a good social network. And so that evidence is really coming in and bringing to life based on some of this additional real-life data.
Yeah, this is Everett. So let me be clear that it's interesting. A lot of the questions, and I see this all the time. It seems to be suggesting that real-world evidence, real-world data, is being driven about having negotiations with payers, and that's what I'm telling you. It's really pretty much non-usable in that arena. Now, do not confuse that with the interest in the actual data. So we're very involved in patient wearables and an ability to impact an individual patient and improve outcomes through the wearable. What I'm suggesting is if you have 3 drugs and one of the manufacturers says, I've got this great data and this data proves my drug is better, pay me more, or formulary, it's not being used for that, and I don't see it being used for that anytime in the near future. Are we using this data? Are we improving patient outcomes? Absolutely, one patient at a time. But that doesn't suggest that the drugs are different. That suggests that monitoring a patient and knowing when a congestive heart failure patient is gaining weight, or knowing when a diabetic patient is doing an injection and what was the blood glucose level at the time of the injection, did they overdose, underdose, are they in control? Those are extremely important, but they don't necessarily make me suggest a Novo versus Lilly on a formulary. That's what I was getting at when it comes to payer negotiations.
Right. Now, can we take this discussion a little bit beyond the drug or the pill and talk about non-drug solutions? So when we start talking about combination products, a company has done a clinical study in the U.S. to have their delivery system shown to be safe and effective, would RWE data be useful, real-world evidence data be useful to the payer when it comes to discussions, say, on reimbursement of the device as well as the drug?
Right. So I think I probably answering for the payer. Yes, actually, all of these do become. They're just not today. Again, we can't compare them. So your device, you may show great information from real-world evidence today, but that doesn't necessarily demonstrate that it's that significantly different than somebody else's device. That's the problem, right? You're making a decision between A and B. Having information on A doesn't necessarily mean it's better than B if you don't have information on B. So this is going toward an arc where I believe these things do become a factor, but we're not there yet. We need some standardization. We need some independent collection of the data. We're beginning to do a lot of that ourselves, and so we're monitoring our own patients. We're using these devices. It's very important. So the advice I would give manufacturers, if you're doing this, and you're doing this embedded in your devices because you want to collect information, you need to focus on open source codes and ways that the providers, number one, and the payers, number two, can get access to this, because being furnished with results from a manufacturer versus being able to monitor that patient ourselves and see the difference in the results is a world of difference and will make a big difference in the long term. But absolutely, if we get to the point where we can see differences in devices and differences in outcomes, and very importantly, manufacturers are willing to put a portion of that cost at risk, that those are going to be duplicated in a patient population, then this becomes, and that is where this is headed. So I do believe we'll be there. I don't know if we're going to be there in 3 years or 10. Back when we did electronic prescribing, I learned not to make predictions in time, because what should have happened in a few years took a decade. Is that where the arc of this is going? Yes. Are we there yet? Absolutely not. Are we halfway there yet? No. But is that where it's going? And should manufacturers be paid if their device or their product is better than counterparts? Yes. We just can't tell that today.
So I would suggest, Everett, this is Andy again, I would suggest that when it comes to these combination products where companies have, say pharma companies have developed, say, reusable devices that in addition to the safety and efficacy data that is generated via the clinical trial, that in a, say, observational study and you evaluate, say, compliance, adherence, persistence, and you're able to suggest by meeting certain primary and secondary endpoints, and you use potentially a comparator that may already be on formulary in a study, that you generated the data that you may need to convince a payer that your device is maybe superior, maybe to a certain, in some situations, non-inferior to what's already out there. So you may have generated the evidence needed to have that potential formulary discussion.
Yeah, I will tell you though that non-inferiority, as far as I'm concerned, give you non-inferior reimbursement.
I understand. Yeah.
Which is the same. So it's got to show superiority, and there's got to be an outcome. So, and I'll use some examples without naming products. So I've recently had a manufacturer in the diabetes space suggest they'd be willing to guarantee lower than median number of amputations over a multi-year period for compliant patients on their drug versus competitors. That's interesting. All right.
Yeah.
That's interesting because that's a real impact and a real medical cost and a real human cost to a product and its outcomes. Now, part of that is because they believe their device is a component of that. So to the extent they're willing to put the total additional cost of their delivery system at risk for that, we've got something we can talk about. Other products we've looked at, and there's claims of less hypoglycemia with some products. Probably true. Real world data would be interesting there because we suspect that it's not clinically relevant. That they're not patients that are having real issues with that, and therefore the value of that is much smaller. But when you get into devices, the biggest problem with the devices today, and I call a pill a device, is that patient compliance is terrible, and it's terrible no matter how easy the product is to use, and that's what has to be addressed. I think it's going to take payers, providers, and manufacturers to address that, and that's really where the opportunity is. One reason we're interested in this offer of guaranteeing outcomes because it's only for compliant patients, and that then puts our role and our provider's role into getting these patients compliant at the forefront as well. That's something that we should be responsible for as an industry, the PBM industry, the pharmacy industry, not the pharma, the pharmacy industry, and the provider component.
Very interesting conversation. Can I just make a suggestion to our audience who are being a little bit quiet at the moment, I have to confess, if you could make sure that you're sending in your questions, and as I said at the beginning, making this a conversation, then that's going to definitely ensure that your own queries are actually covered. Lisa, I'm very interested to hear from your perspective as somebody who's working very closely with patients as to whether or not what you're hearing at the moment is news to you, and what influence what Everett's been saying actually has on the design of what you're doing. Does it encourage it, or does it slow it down?
No, I think it's not new. As I said, claims and EMRs, and we have had good experience with using some of the EMR data with some payers as well, are the traditional data. But even to get to the point that Everett was saying about, okay, guaranteeing hypoglycemic outcomes, we need to use and have used these kind of databases to do a better job of segmenting patients and predicting behavior, because we've been involved where we have taken responsibility for some of the adherence, and some of our services goal is to drive adherence. So I would say all of this makes it even more important to me that the patient's point of view is taken into account, and kind of drives our need to understand patients better. So to me, that it makes the patient-related data even more important, not less important, in terms of seeing what the unmet need is, predicting what populations we want to target in even in our phase 3 studies, making sure we collect the right data. People said, as Everett said, the basis is the clinical data, but the clinical data is beginning to include in many areas now patient data from wearables and monitoring, as well as we're doing the studies. So I think the role of the patients and the role of broad types of data in actually developing products and services that are going to have big impact, that's consistent with the previous discussion. Because otherwise, all of it is about just the price of the product. If that's the only thing, then it's to come out of the industry.
I would just add that the compliance conundrum is certainly one that, as an industry, holistically, we all share, whether it's the provider, it's the pharmaceutical organizations, the carriers, payers, et cetera. And, when you think about sort of, to add on to what Lisa's saying to a large extent, when you look at some of this real-life data, you can start to see insights about the patient that really allows you to personalize intervention. So to some degree, we're talking a little bit about personalized medicine without sort of the genomic element, right? And so as you think about, a new insulin-dependent individual with diabetes, type 2 diabetes, you can see whether or not that patient is going to get a refill 21 days prior based on what the evidence is showing in the consumer data, whether it's an increase in weight, whether it's sort of a reduction in activity, whether it's things like their sleep patterns. And so to the extent that you can then get in front of that prescription refill to really help advance compliance, that's an advantage for all of us, and all of us stand to win, including the patient, in terms of, it helps with the titration factor, it helps sort of get them on a better road, if you will, towards feeling better, but certainly this compliance conundrum and leveraging sort of this real-life data really does help us in terms of taking our finite resources of outreach, whether it's nurses or other clinical staff, if you will, and really trigger them at individuals with greatest need at the right moment in time. And so we sort of look at these things as nudges to compliance or moments to influence behavior. Otherwise, the consumer is sort of going to go on their own trajectory, and how might we get smarter about those personalized interventions?
And just to add to what Christine just said, we see that as kind of increasing our ability to do next generation service interventions, so that we don't just have static patient support programs and then evaluate them over 6 months and then find out what worked or didn't, but in terms of our ability to real-time change messages and messengers, whether it's prompts or nurses or others, to impact patient behavior. And also that is to change provider behavior, because a lot of the adherence issue also was related to provider-patient communication and our ability to enhance that and to make providers more successful in shaping patient behavior will reinforce provider behavior to support effective interventions as well.
At this stage, thank you so much, by the way, Lisa. We're having a bit of trouble just trying to sort out the background screen, so sorry about that. But just going to bring in some of the audience comments. By the way, I've got quite a few people who've written in just saying, loving the conversation, really interesting conversation, so keep that up, guys. Thank you. But I've got Alvaro, who says, could you talk about performance-based risk-sharing arrangements? And yes, of course, risk-sharing was something that we were going to bring up between payers and manufacturers involving real-world evidence generation. I've got Kartik Shirur saying, is RWE collected from private manufacturers of wearables like Apple, Samsung, Fitbit, etc.? And if so, Is there concern about compatibility of data formats used by all the different companies? Concerns about portability of data as well between different wearables? Chris Geisler says that he'd love to hear about how data from across RWE and data sources are being evaluated. Most discussion, of course, has been about a specific drug or device, and the reality is that patients are using multiple drugs, devices, and seeing several providers, and so how does that actually feature? Now, as Merchant says, have any payers shared risk with pharma and patients by offering bonuses for good compliance as monitored by a wearable device? And we see similarities to that in other industries, so that's quite an interesting question. John Rowe actually asks a similar question, I think. Are the vendors willing to put their assurances into the contracts with penalties for non-achievement? So slightly different, but same mentality. And we've got a few more questions coming in, which I shall come back to at a later stage. But does anybody want to tackle any of the questions I've just read out?
This is Everett. I'm happy to tackle it, and they seem to fall really in two categories. And one of those is about the future of risk. And we have some risk contracts. I will tell you, risk contracts today come in two forms. There's some that are fairly public that are little more than marketing initiatives from the industry's perspective. And in some cases, some of the payers are going along, honestly, because they want the marketing initiative as well. And these are when you have almost predictable, achievable outcomes results that are being guaranteed, and the dollars at risk are almost, are pretty trivial. So you're guaranteeing, I'll pay you. I guarantee your house doesn't fall down. If it does, I'll pay you $1. It's sort of not a real guarantee, but people are positioning those as if they are risk guarantees. We have a number that we move forward with that have more risk associated with it in the short term, particularly around, for example, the inflammatory conditions and diabetes. That is ultimately where the industry would like to get, I think, on the pharma side. I think it's also where the payer side of the industry would like to get, but I'll bet for very different reasons and with very different perspectives. And this kind of ties into the second component, which is about payers paying bonuses. The challenge with that today is largely the payer community feels they're overpaying, and they see this as a way of getting some money back if the results don't happen. I think it's really going to be challenging to get a reward for something when you're already getting what is viewed as a premium to its value. And so you'd have to get something much lower than the potential value and then pay a premium on that. That's how every other industry works. If you're getting the premium, you probably need to take the risk as opposed to get a bonus. And the reason I say they're from different sides is I believe pharma believes they can get more money by proving their worth. And I would tell you that most payers believe they'll have to pay a lot less if they can figure out the value.
So this notion of path to value has, definitely been something that the payer community on the insurance side has really sort of taken great hold, particularly on the physician side. And, clearly makes sense when you look at the overall pharmacy spend represents about 17%. And the other, spend is distributed, between hospital physicians, that sort of thing. And so as you look at kind of the traditional insurance payer side, the path to value conversation has really sort of shifted primarily within the hospital and physician community as the first entry point. And what you've seen is, they all started out with a bonus structure, whereby for certain quality indicators you would get paid a bonus. And then it's kind of progressed and moved into more of a shared savings and then to where monies are sort of fully at risk. And there is an upside potential certainly for the provider community. And so if you use that as an analog to what may happen on the pharmacy side, I think naturally you'll see, to Everett's point, not so much sort of the bonus payment, because it is, as he's saying, there already is this fundamental belief that you're paying a premium for the service, but rather when you look at the outcomes and the related sort of improvements whether it be improvements to compliance, improvements to compliance against evidence-based medicine, a reduction in some of the critical metrics for each of the related disease categories. That's really where a shared savings type of arrangement or other risk models really make sense. And so, again, using sort of that traditional kind of path to value sort of analog of what's happening in the industry with the hospital systems and the physician community to really sort of say what's likely to happen in the pharmacy industry, I think is sort of a natural sort of evolution. And certainly as the pharmacy spend has continued to rise at, double-fold sort of increases over the last many years, there is a much of a great movement in terms of trying to sort of rein that in and collaborate in ways that really help sort of adjust the trend bend, if you will, equation that the industry is sort of faced with, as well as really trying to help reduce things like I heard earlier the example that Everett used around, a reduction in amputations, a reduction in hospitalizations, readmissions, those sorts of things that really the industry kind of takes hold of. So as you think about and correlate to things like STARS ratings or those penalties, if you will, the industry is sort of faced with, if you can show and prove evidence that you can make an improvement there, that's a likely attention gainer in terms of the conversation to move them forward.
Thank you. I'd like to bring the conversation back slightly to the sourcing and an actual mining and analysis of the data, if that's all right, as that was very much the headline we used at the beginning. And I want to make sure that we've covered that topic properly. So I'm going to get our audience, who I still notice being very attentive, which is great, to answer another question, which you should hopefully see on your screen just now. You'll notice that the answers are very similar to what you saw before, and this is a bit more of a future-focused one. Of all of the following data source types, which do you believe you will invest in most over the next 1 to 2 years? Maybe the previous 5-10 minutes of discussion have influenced you there, but be very keen to know what your actual plans are. And don't worry, this is anonymous, so we're not going to be hauling you up on your decision. So you're only getting one choice this time, so you have to choose the one that you believe you'll invest in most going forward from this point of view. We've got about 30% of votes, and I can already see that the results are quite different from the last time we asked the question about where you actually are at the moment. So I'll hold that open for a few more seconds, see if those proportions change or not. Let's go 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Thank you very much, everybody. Let's have a look. Okay, so as I said, it's a bit different, and you can see that the trend is actually away, perhaps, from the investment in the core EMR and claims database and towards the real-life data area. So perhaps, Christine, that gives you a little bit more confidence for the future, and it does seem that your work with Evidation is certainly going to be valued going forward. Less so on the PRO side, and of course on the something else side. So, Christine, I know you've just spoken, but I'm interested in your immediate reaction to that going from here.
Yeah, I mean, directionally, this is quite honestly somewhat of a surprise. It's actually enlightening, if you will, to see sort of the industry kind of understand the impact of understanding the patient more deeply. And I think it sort of demonstrates, if you will, that we all have a stake in sort of wanting to fix some of the underlying issues that we're plagued with. Again, we mentioned compliance, patient compliance earlier. We mentioned things like outcomes and really getting to true outcomes. But if we attack and continue to attack it as a one-size-fits-all sort of equation, which is largely what's happened, we don't sort of bend the trend. We don't sort of yield the results that all of us ultimately want to do. And so realizing that resources are somewhat finite, and yet we still all have goals and objectives that we're trying to hit, leveraging this real life data to really inform and influence kind of these trigger points, or getting to kind of target and segment the population in different and novel ways is really exciting, but it's also going to prove great opportunity. And certainly there's a lot of low-hanging fruit opportunities, and there's certainly more complicated things that can come to bear in terms of leveraging this patient data. So I'm excited to see this shift in movement based on sort of a reaction from the previous sort of poll results to this slide. So, you know, looking forward to collaborating with folks and really seeing how we can put this good use data to use, because essentially, again, the patient's going to win, which is kind of the key stakeholder here, but providers will be more informed with triggers and outreach, as well as, you know, all of us benefiting holistically.
Yeah, and I think from a
sorry, go on. Go on.
Sorry, Paul. I was going to say, from a pharma standpoint, this really doesn't surprise me very much. And the reason I say that is if you look at publications recently, you can see where the investments that, the top 20 pharma are making in digital health. So to see that the thought is over the next 1 to 2 years, there's going to be a significant investment in real life data doesn't surprise me at all. Now, to kind of go back based on my introduction, even from a regulatory standpoint, if FDA did not think that this was the direction that industry was heading, they would not have set up a digital health office. And that's exactly what they have done, because they know that their current processes and regulations and guidance documents that are in place cannot accommodate where the life science industry is headed from a digital health perspective. So I'm not surprised at all.
Yeah, and I would agree. It's consistent with the push towards focusing on patients, segmenting patients, understanding patients better, developing products with patient segments in mind, developing services with patient segments in mind. That's where we need to. That's where it's consistent with our strategy and with many big pharma strategy. So.
Yeah, and this is. I am surprised. I'm surprised it's not skewed a little more toward patient. The manufacturers I'm to. This is clearly where the focus is in the chronic diseases, and it's also where the payer focus is. Let's look at the money we're investing in trying to tie together these data streams. Very important to us that we can get them in one place, and therefore our pharmacists and other providers, as well as patients, can have the information, because most patients that for where this is beneficial are on multiple devices, multiple drugs, and having that synced up and being able to see it very important. I think this is great for patients. It's actually great for outcomes. Again, it may not make much difference, though, when it comes to negotiation, simply because everybody's doing it, and the difference between one company and the other is not likely to be great.
Well, we'll see. We'll see. I'm sure companies will look for differentiation, but we shall see. Given that everyone is either surprised or unsurprised, but certainly pleased by the direction, I think that we should just skip on to the next question, which is actually about barriers. This is my final question for you. So just hang on a second. Sorry, we seem to have written two options on the screen here. So what is the greatest challenge in using real-life data for payer negotiations? We're going to again ask you to just choose one. I'm pretty sure that some of you would like to choose all five here, so I'm forcing you to choose your greatest source of pain, which is not very nice, I realize, but that's how we're rolling here. Generating data of high quality and accuracy, sourcing appropriate data for your needs, merging insights with other data to build up a proposition that works, payer attitude acceptance of these novel data types. We've obviously heard a bit about that just now. And then perhaps an internal lack of understanding as to what is valued, a sort of don't know exactly where to start mentality that you did hear about quite a lot. So we've had about a third of you vote so far. I'll hold that open for another few seconds. This is the final poll question, so do make sure you get your throw your hat in the ring if you haven't done. And of course, we've only got a few minutes left, so this is really your final chance to ask an open question. So definitely make sure that you don't waste these last few minutes and get your question into the Q&A box as quickly as you can. Right, I'm going to close that vote now. We've got a majority of people in. Let's have a look. Right, it's relatively even, I would say, everything hovering between 10 and 30%. But I guess you've got pretty much a joint three options here: the generating of high quality and accuracy, the merging insights with other data, and the payer attitude and acceptance. So there is clearly some work to do in several areas here. And I'd be very interested actually in starting with the pharma panelists as to perhaps you can give us a little light on some of the examples that you've experienced within your own companies of successes and failures when it's come to this sort of area. What from your point of view has worked and what hasn't worked, and what lessons have you learned? So let's go back to Lisa to begin with.
I think the biggest challenge is actually linking high quality data. So our experience has been that when people start with populations, they tell us that they have large numbers of patients with disease X, Y, or Z. I'll say a disease like multiple sclerosis. But then when you look at what you can link together across the databases with high quality, the population size shrinks significantly. So suddenly you start with millions of patients and you're down to hundreds of thousands, and then you're down to like 5,000 or 10,000. So to me, the biggest challenge, and again, I'm not necessarily saying that payer negotiation is the ultimate objective that I'm using the data for. That's number one. But even just getting that data to drive internal decisions about where to go, what to do, and to develop services and to show product value. That the biggest challenge to me is getting high quality linked data across actually significant size population.
Do you concur, Andy?
Yes, I would echo Lisa's sentiment as well. And the quality of the data and the accuracy of the data across huge what is initially, as Lisa described, very large populations, regardless of the disease, whether you're talking autoimmune or neurology or whatever it may be, is a significant hurdle these days for us. Even before payer negotiations, we're wanting to make sure that we have the quality and of the data that we need and accurate data. So I would echo exactly what Lisa said.
So, Christine, what's your response to that? Have you got any pearls of wisdom that you might be able to share, as people clearly are trying to do this stuff going forward?
Yeah, I mean, certainly I think this, the quality of data is definitely been something that for a large part the industry has struggled with. I think, generally we've heard a lot over the last couple of years about interoperability challenges between sort of how, the health plan might look at data, how the provider might look at data, how, consumers look at data, how you in the pharmacy industry, pharmaceutical industry look at data. And so, that's a challenge. And combining all of these data in a way that sort of allows you to not only link the patient data, because that in of itself is a challenge, but really sort of creating sort of like what's sort of most important. And so, with Evidation and sort of our ability and sort of history of working with all of these disparate data sources, you create predictive models, you create sort of triggers and tools that really help you inform and influence kind of how best to intervene and how to leverage the information with much more rigor, as well as normalize the data. So, take the tracker data, just from the various wearables. You know, the way a step is counted in each organization or with each device has a different sort of context to it. And so how do you sort of parse out sort of the noise, if you will? And so the normalization process and leveraging, you know, true data scientists to really look and hone in the information becomes a challenge, and it's a value proposition, and yet an expense that many companies haven't quite invested in. And so, you know, most of where the data analytics have resided in many companies is really around business intelligence. And so how do we use some of the information to kind of advance us, or how are we thinking about our results and KPIs or metrics, but not necessarily how do you get deep at the patient and the related patient community. And so it definitely takes a different skill set, a different sort of lens and view of deeply understanding the consumer. And part of what we're seeing happening in the industry is you're taking people who really come from consumer products, so out of industry kind of individuals who deeply understand the consumer, whether that be from technology or from other sorts of industries, to really kind of tackle this healthcare dilemma and this sort of getting at the quality of data and really sort of matching the patient, and even in the absence of the patient data, how might you clone the population such that you can make insights with great confidence around the behaviors of one, again, without sort of the real-life data to augment. And so we're seeing quite a bit of shift, and you're seeing a lot of advancements with AI and other resources of machine learning to really help predict this. But again, I would say as a whole, the industry is relatively new at understanding this data, but it takes a lot of really specific experience to really kind of tackle this. And we're seeing lots of really great results early on in terms of, as I mentioned earlier, getting at, you know, greater patient compliance and or predicting people's behaviors based on the data that's being ingested. And the exhaust accordingly then is about more targeted outreach and intervention to help improve, you know, outcomes, bend the trend, and really get to quicker results.
Thank you, Christine. I'm acutely aware that we are fast running out of time. I'd like to just quickly read out a couple more of the audience questions and give anyone a final opportunity to answer those, and then we shall wrap up if that's all right. I've got some questions here. Some devices are being developed which transmit use or compliance data remotely to a provider. Has something like this been piloted by a payer to alert providers or create a digital safety net? I've got another question here. To what extent are qualitative methodologies being used or should be used to provide the context in a world where big data and now life data is on the rise? I've got a couple of questions about social media. I don't think we've had social media really spoken about explicitly, and how valid people feel that should be incorporated into reimbursement submissions, and the trend for that going into the future. I've got a question here. Don't you think the risk-based model of diagnostics is a better and more likely model than the physician-hospital model? I'll be honest with you, I don't totally understand that question, John, so you may want to clarify. Chris has just written in 2 seconds ago, I propose a different perspective. Much of this conclusion is based on the question being asked, the hypothesis being tested, and how the insight would be applied. Example, data may only be high quality for a small patient population, but it could be an indication to pursue a specific study. Now, I realize that's quite a few questions, and I've skipped a lot as well for the last minute or two, but does anyone from the panel have a burning response that they want to express before we finish?
Hi, this is Everett. I can answer. We have active pilots right now where we're utilizing data either from devices that are manufactured devices or devices that are fitted onto other devices that are being provided to providers, and looking at the impact of that. We also are spending a fair amount of time trying to merge some of these data streams, and I think ultimately the payers will have to do it. So taking information from the insulin devices is interesting in that you can see compliance and if you can impact compliance, but it becomes very interesting when you combine it with blood glucose monitoring devices and lab results like A1Cs. So that is something we actually have active pilots doing that, for example.
Thank you. It's quite clear that we could keep this conversation going for at least another half hour, if not half day. But unfortunately, we have run out of time, and I want to respect everybody's schedules. I do want to obviously express a huge thank you to our speakers who've given up their time today. I do also want to say that if you have enjoyed this discussion, there are two actions that I would propose. The first one is that this is just a snippet of a conversation that will be happening in a much larger form at an event that we are planning in November this year. If you can look at your screen, you'll have a quick look now there, and there should be a link at the bottom there, or an address that you can go to find out a bit more. You won't see Andy's name on this screen, but he will be there, as well as the CEO of Evdation, and really would love for you to be a part of this discussion. This is very much our flagship access and evidence event, and it's going to actually incorporate a huge range of the various job titles that are all coming together for this event. So obviously, I'm going to recommend it, but I'm not doing so just because of my position. I genuinely believe that a lot of hard work has gone into this product, and it's going to be a transformational couple of days. So do have a look at that. The other thing I would say is that if you've enjoyed hearing from Christine today, that there is obviously the ability to follow up and learn more from her, and you would have seen the email address that she presented previously, which I believe was contact@evidation.com. I think that is right. Yeah, that's right. And please do follow up with her if you would like to continue that conversation, as they do have a huge amount more in their armory that may be able to help you out. That's it from me. I'm pleased to say that we still have 90% of our audience that started with us today still online, so that shows that the conversation has been stimulating. And once again, huge thank you to the 4 people who have given up their time, and I hope they've gained something from it too as well. I'll wish you a fantastic rest of your day. I'll go back to the rainy summer that obviously is being in London, and I hope that you have a better time than I do. So have a good time, good luck with it all, and hopefully see you in November. Thank you, everybody.